The brass casing had barely stopped spinning in the dirt when the insult cut through the dry heat like a slap. "Old men talk, but they don't listen. Go polish a rifle stock, Grandpa." Laughter followed, sharp and easy, like it had practice. The kind of laugh that comes not from wit, but from the safety of a crowd. The young soldier's grin was wide and unbothered, teeth bright against the dust settling from the last volley of fire. His weapon still hung loose at his side, barrel slightly tilted toward the ground, his hands cocky, shoulders loose with sweat and pride. Around him, a knot of other recruits lingered near the folding benches at the rear of the marksmanship range, some smirking, some watching quietly, none stepping in. The man on the receiving end stood still. He wore base-issued ear protection looped lazily around his neck, not in use. His safety vest was zipped halfway, a faded range badge clipped crooked at the edge. His trousers, old-style United States Army fatigues, were too worn to pass inspection today, but every crease had purpose. A small cloth notepad peeked from his back pocket, the kind a soldier used long before tablets and digital diagnostics. His name was not yet known to the men laughing. His reaction was simple. He blinked once, slow and heavy, and the wrinkle at the edge of his jaw twitched, not from anger but restraint. He didn't return the insult. He didn't even shift his stance. He looked past the young soldier, across the scorched grass of the field, and tilted his chin toward the sunset-colored range markers fluttering in the breeze. Then he turned and walked away. Behind him, one of the spotters, a square-shouldered man in a training vest with stripes dulled by sun, lowered his binoculars. His mouth stayed closed, but his eyes, deep under the shade of his hat, followed the old man's steps all the way to the bench at the far end of the range. The clipboard in his lap had a name written in block letters, and next to it, a mark. Not a warning, not a reprimand, just a circle. A breath passed. A bird flapped once overhead. Somewhere downrange, a distant target tilted in the wind and clicked gently against its metal hinge. But this time, someone was listening, very closely. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The range bench at the far end had no shade, just a bleached plywood table warped slightly in the sun, its edges splintered from years of elbows and field manuals. Jim Rourke lowered himself onto the wooden bench without ceremony, his knees protesting the descent with a dull stiffness that had become more familiar than unwelcome. He sat with both feet flat, spine straight, and pulled a soft cloth from the pocket of his vest. He began cleaning the bolt of a training rifle, not because it needed it, but because it was Friday, and this was how he always started his hour. His fingers moved slowly, but with the kind of grace that only comes from a lifetime of repetition. Cotton cloth looped twice around the bolt, thumb pressed just firm enough to feel for friction. His gaze steady as dust floated through the hot air. The sounds of the range filled in behind him again. Safeties clicking, magazines slapping home, instructors calling cadence across the uneven terrain. But here, at the edge of the chaos, Jim moved like he was still in a world of structure. He wasn't there to talk. He was there because this was his last piece of home. James Rourke, 76 years old, retired after 33 years in uniform. The paperwork said his last role was range safety advisor, but that wasn't why he came every week. He had buried his wife 5 winters ago. Since then, every Friday morning, he arrived at 0700 sharp, signed himself in at the rusted side gate, and walked the perimeter alone before drills began. Not for oversight, for memory. He never offered advice unless asked. But when a soldier hesitated at the trigger, or a recruit's grouping fell apart in the stress lanes, Jim would lean in and ask a simple question like, "You squeezing or slapping?" And most of the time, that was enough. Today, he had done the same. The young private, Danning, that was his name, had fired 3 uneven bursts, all low left, his cheek welled sloppy. Jim had offered a single sentence, nothing more. "You're pressing too hard with the heel of your palm. It's throwing your muzzle." But before he could finish, Danning had laughed, loud and loose. the way only a man with something to prove could. The words still hung in the dry heat, echoing faintly in Jim's ears. Old men talk, but they don't listen. He didn't carry bitterness, not anymore. What he carried were names of boys who hadn't come home, names of men who had frozen mid-step in the worst heat of combat, not from fear, but from not knowing what to do next. He saw those same shoulders in Danning, the same twitch in the firing hand. But time and uniform didn't move together. Respect these days didn't wear boots. A single drop of sweat slid from his temple, caught in the creased fold near his cheek, and vanished into the collar of his faded undershirt. His hands kept working, rag over metal, cloth to oil, thumb to grain. 20 yards away, a cluster of young soldiers loitered around the ammo table. Danning had reloaded by now, leaning back against the crate like he was posing for a brochure, the steel of his weapon bouncing sunlight off his thigh. He mimicked Jim's earlier movements, exaggerating them with mock seriousness. "Grip it like this, boys. That's how General Grandpa taught me," he said, throwing a wink toward the others. They chuckled. One of them, a little quieter than the rest, turned halfway toward the field and then back again. Jim didn't look up. He'd seen the act before. Not just in these young men, but in himself, long ago when he was barely shaving, full of talk, and green enough to believe silence was weakness. He had mocked someone once too. He remembered the way it burned afterward, long after the laughter died. It was why he never raised his voice anymore. The lesson always came, one way or another. At the command tent, an older silhouette leaned forward slightly. Master Sergeant Delgado had been watching the whole thing unfold from behind mirrored sunglasses. He'd seen Jim arrive that morning, seen the limp in his walk, the way he paused at firing lane 7 like he always did, the place where one of their own had collapsed 15 years earlier during a live fire exercise gone wrong. Delgado hadn't planned to speak with him today. Jim didn't like fuss. But something about the way Danning's words had landed, something about the way Jim had stood still. Back on the bench, Jim pulled a fresh rag from his pouch and continued with the next rifle. The bolts clicked softly under his fingers, the cloth whispering over the grooves like a prayer said by muscle memory. This wasn't the first time someone rolled their eyes at him, but today, it wouldn't end there. The sun hung high, dragging heat into every surface, like it had been given orders. The gravel along the edge of the firing lanes shimmered faintly, dust curling up beneath each slow boot step. Jim moved across the line, clipboard in one hand, magnetic wand in the other, gathering spent casings like he was collecting stories that had already been told. He didn't bend fully, not anymore. Instead, he leaned, one hand on his thigh for balance, eyes sharp, knees stiff, the creak of his joints hidden beneath the low pop of rifles still echoing in the distance. Each brass casing clicked against the wand's magnet with a delicate clink, the sound barely audible over the steady rhythm of grunts repacking magazines, instructors calling times, and the metal-on-metal sounds of bolts being worked through muscle memory. The heat thickened around them all, sticking to skin, clinging to cloth, as if the very air wanted to remind everyone that time passed here slower than anywhere else. On the back of Jim's neck, sweat gathered and ran down between his shoulder blades beneath his vest. But he didn't flinch. He never did. Private Danning leaned again against the edge of the ammo table, his rifle slung casually against his chest, thumb hooked in his belt loop, posture all loose confidence. He was watching Jim, not studying him. Watching, like you'd watch a squirrel dig at something you didn't think it could lift. "Hey," he said, not loudly, but just enough for the others around him to hear. "You think he's cleaning those so he can take them home? Maybe build a brass museum in his garage?" A soft chuckle followed from the group, tight and uncomfortable. Another soldier, a younger recruit with dark eyes and a quiet lean to his stance, didn't laugh. He shifted slightly, gaze flickering toward Jim, then back to his own boots. He knew enough not to speak. Not here. Not yet. But the line had wavered. Respect had a pulse, even if it hadn't spoken yet. Jim turned slowly and made his way toward the far edge of the course, where Lane 4's bench had been slightly offset after last week's storm knocked down half the wind barrier. He stooped, retrieving a crumpled water bottle someone had left behind, dropped it into his satchel, and adjusted the cone marking the safe line. Each motion was deliberate, not because he was slow, because he was trained that way. Precision was its own kind of discipline, one you didn't forget, even when your back hurt and your hands shook. Behind him, Danning leaned into one of the other soldiers and smirked. Pretty sure he still calls rifles muskets. What do you think? Civil War or Korea? The laughter this time was louder, unchecked. It drifted out into the open space like smoke from an oil fire. It didn't matter if Jim heard. That was the point. It was meant to hang there, to sting even without striking. Jim kept walking. The next casing he picked up was bent, crushed slightly at the mouth. He turned it between his fingers, felt the damage, and dropped it in a different pouch, his disposal bag. Even trash had its place. Even spent things could be handled with care. His thumb brushed across the metal, felt the groove where the impact had folded the edge. He didn't speak, but something in his jaw set tighter. Not from pride, from memory. Danning watched that too. There was a flicker, brief, in his face. Something he didn't yet recognize. Not guilt, not understanding. Just a pause. It vanished before it took root. Another staff member passed behind Jim, a corporal named Vargas, nodded once in his direction. Not friendly, not cold, just acknowledgement. That was more than most gave. In this place, silence meant different things. Sometimes it meant deference, sometimes discomfort. The line between them was thin and walked daily. The gravel gave under Jim's boots as he reached the end of the course and checked the edge tape. It had slipped slightly after a troop had nearly stepped over the boundary earlier that morning. He didn't ask permission. He just fixed it. One knee dropped, steadying himself. Hand pressed into the dry dirt, fingers working the line back into place. Behind him, more laughter. Not about him this time. Just young men talking about something else now. But the tone lingered. It always did. No one offered to help him. They never did. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't notice. That's how it always was. The magazine slid into place with a sharp slap. Private Danning made sure the sound carried, letting the weight of his performance hang in the air. His movements were exaggerated now, more for the eyes around him than for function. He turned just enough to be seen over his shoulder and lifted the rifle chest high, not to aim, but to gesture. It was no longer training. It was theater. "Hey, Sergeant," he called, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby staff. "Think I should ask Grandpa if I'm holding it right? Maybe he's got some Gettysburg wisdom for me." The range fell quiet enough for the wind to be heard pushing through the canvas shades overhead. A few soldiers chuckled again, not all of them. One or two glanced away, uneasy now. The edges of the group were fraying. The joke had become too practiced, the performance too mean. Jim had just finished straightening the line marker near the target reset cable. He stood slowly, hand pressing against the worn small of his back, and took 2 careful steps away from the line. He didn't respond, not with words, but something in the way he set the cable clamp into the dirt, exact, precise, deliberate, made it clear he had heard. Danning wasn't finished. He walked forward, half loping like a man on a stage, and raised his weapon again, aiming it loosely at the ground several feet from Jim's boots, pointed safely, technically, but close enough to humiliate. "You want to adjust my grip, sir?" he said, emphasis dripping from the final word. "Or are you still tuned to black and white television settings?" It wasn't just disrespect now. It was provocation. The soldier to Danning's left shifted uncomfortably. Another muttered something under his breath and walked toward the water station. A few staff members on the far end of the range looked up, uncertain if intervention was needed or if this was just young arrogance finding its boundary. Jim turned his head slightly, not enough to face Danning, just enough to acknowledge his presence. His eyes didn't narrow. His shoulders didn't lift. He simply looked, steady, patient, the kind of look that used to make lieutenants second-guess their tone. And then, as if the conversation hadn't occurred, he bent down again and returned to checking the tension on the target bracket. Back to work. Back to silence. That was the cut Danning didn't expect. No response, no defense, just dignity in the face of dismissal. It lit something petty in him. He knelt quickly and swept a handful of gravel toward the target Jim had just repaired. The stones rattled against the base plate, unsettling the freshly set frame. Then he laughed, stood up, and walked away like nothing had happened. "Just helping you test the line," he said over his shoulder. "You know, teamwork." A pause followed. That kind of pause that soldiers feel before a command is issued, before the sound of the range matters again, before the reprimand lands. It didn't come. Yet. The senior training officer overseeing the field, a quiet staff sergeant with scars on both hands and little patience for games, stepped forward slightly from the shaded platform. His gaze locked on Jim for a moment, then turned to Danning. He spoke with a voice low but firm. "Private, knock it off." Danning, still smiling, lifted both palms like a comedian retreating from a joke. "Just banter, Sergeant. Man's gotta learn to take a little heat." A few heads turned. This time the laughter was gone. Jim stood again, brush in hand, and returned to the bracket. He pressed the edge of his boot against the base, checking its hold, then knelt a second time and fixed the alignment. His knuckles had darkened with dirt, but he didn't wipe them clean. The fingers moved with a steadiness that no longer needed approval. The bent casing he'd set aside earlier now rested in his palm again. He turned it once, looked down at the crushed brass, and closed his hand around it slowly. And still, Jim didn't flinch. Jim Rourke moved to the bench just past the last firing station, where the sun had begun to stretch shadows beneath the canopy strung across 4 rusted poles. The bench was warped, its grain silvered by weather, but it held. He sat slowly, not with the hesitation of pain, but with the precision of a man who understood time was not to be rushed. His vest shifted as he lowered himself, the back catching briefly on the old bolt sticking from the post behind him. He adjusted without a sound. From his side pouch, he pulled a worn rag, not the one he used for brass, but one folded into a perfect square, the creases like corners of an old map. He laid it across the bench and placed each tool on top, one at a time, all arranged as if they might be inspected. His hands, though marked by tremor and time, moved like they still reported to someone. The spent casings in his collection bag clinked softly as he opened it. He began wiping each one, not for shine, not for reuse, but because it was part of his rhythm, a ritual that gave shape to his mornings. He worked slowly, thumb and cloth polishing the edges, turning each brass shell toward the sun just long enough to catch its history in the light. Some still carried the faint mark of heat near the neck. Others were flattened slightly from impact. None were discarded carelessly. Around him, the rhythm of the range continued. Bursts of fire echoed against the hills, followed by clipped instructions from officers pacing the line. The smell of burnt powder mixed with the dry scent of parched earth and boot leather. Sweat soaked into the backs of uniforms. Radios crackled with check-ins. But Jim sat still, hands moving, head low, eyes tracking every surface of the tools in front of him. Behind the weapons table, Private Danning leaned once more against a supply crate, his rifle resting in the crook of his elbow, the sun glaring off its barrel. He glanced toward Jim only once, as if expecting to see irritation or retreat. But there was nothing in the old man's face to feed from. No rebuttal, no smirk. Just the slow, clean rhythm of a man performing his duty. Jim paused only once, when a casing slipped from the rag and rolled toward the edge of the bench. He caught it mid-drop, with a quickness that betrayed the age in his bones. His hand had moved with reflex, not luck, and for a brief second, his fingers curled around it like they'd done countless times before in another life, under different noise, under heavier fire. The soldier from earlier, the one who hadn't laughed, passed behind him carrying a crate of empty magazines. He glanced down at the old man, noticed the arrangement of tools, the precision of the wipe, the posture that spoke without speaking. He didn't say anything, just walked slower. Farther back, at the base of the observation tower, Master Sergeant Delgado stood in place, one boot resting on the bottom rail of the structure. His arms were crossed, but not stiffly. He wasn't watching Danning anymore. His eyes had settled on Jim, as if trying to remember something long left unsaid. The old man placed the cleaned casing into a separate pouch and reached for another. The sun caught his wrist, where an old burn scar stretched thin beneath the sweat-darkened hairs. It looked like it had been there for decades. He didn't hide it. Every casing went through the same process. Examine, polish, rotate, pouch, like breathwork, like prayer. The contrast deepened with every moment. Others moved with urgency, voices rising and falling in bursts, dust kicked up by hurried boots and barked commands. But Jim remained constant, a calm in the middle of men chasing adrenaline and rank. He didn't chase anything. He had already caught what mattered long ago, and carried it with him every day since. One of the younger corporals passed behind him and said nothing, but adjusted his path slightly so the dust from his boots wouldn't cloud the bench. A small thing, but Jim noticed. This was how respect returned, not with apologies, but with space. He reached for another casing, cleaned, polished, placed. The tremor in his hand hadn't lessened, but his control of it hadn't either. His eyes narrowed as he tilted the brass just enough to inspect the rim. Satisfied, he nodded once to no one. The range noise continued, but something in the tone had shifted. And at the edge of the canopy, watching through mirrored lenses and a crease of growing concern, the senior enlisted man said nothing. Yet, Master Sergeant Miguel Delgado stood beneath the overhang of the command post, his right shoulder leaning against the wooden support beam where the paint had long since peeled from heat and dust. The base of his boot rocked against the toe of the other, not from impatience, but from habit, the kind picked up after 30 years of standing watch and knowing when to wait. A plastic coffee cup sat cooling in his left hand, untouched for almost half an hour. Its contents had turned bitter long ago, but he hadn't noticed. His attention was fixed beyond the firing line, past the rifles and bodies and noise. He was watching Jim Rourke, not watching in passing, not with curiosity, watching like a man who remembered something worth remembering, and was only now realizing it had returned in the form of this weathered frame of a man polishing brass casings in the heat, as if time itself had not managed to bend his spine or break his resolve. Delgado had seen Jim's name on the volunteer advisor roster that morning. He had marked it only because the handwriting was familiar, not typed, not filed, not flagged, just signed. A short looping J and an R with a hard break in the tail. He hadn't made the connection then. Not until the old man had walked the line with a steel-toed shuffle and a gaze like a measuring tape. There were veterans, and then there were men like Rourke, those who carried stillness the way others carried stripes. He remembered the stories now, not the citations. Those were easy to find. No, the stories were different, quieter, passed from one squad to another in tents and trucks. How Rourke had once crawled through 200 feet of broken glass and rebar in Fallujah to pull a bleeding corporal from under collapsed concrete. How he'd rerouted communications during a blackout using only stripped wire, a radio battery, and his own body as the ground point. Half the younger soldiers didn't know that story anymore. Delgado did. He had heard it from his brother who had made it home. The cup in Delgado's hand trembled slightly as the wind shifted. He set it down on the railing beside him, slowly, with purpose. Across the field, Private Danning was still pacing near the magazine table, checking the chamber of his weapon like he was about to win something. But Delgado's eyes never left Jim, not even when the private looked toward him, expecting approval, or maybe a nod. He received neither. Jim had just placed another casing in his pouch and was adjusting the tight knot on one of the safety flags marking the edge of the active line. His fingers moved like they were reading a manual only he could see. The tape fluttered once, caught by the breeze, and he stepped back just enough to let it pass. Delgado looked down at the training roster. There it was, Live fire adaptive simulation, third rotation. Danning listed under Alpha Group. Jim noted as civilian range advisor, observer clearance. A small asterisk next to his name, indicating volunteer status with command authorization. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. He pulled the pen from his chest pocket and drew a single line beneath the names. Nothing fancy, just a mark, a decision made. He didn't call anyone over, didn't speak into the radio. He just turned slightly, enough to face the staff member managing the loadout schedule, and tapped the paper with the tip of his pen. Then he folded it closed. Back at the bench, Jim had finished his cleaning routine. He stood, carefully packed his tools back into the field bag that looked older than most of the recruits, and walked toward the edge of the course. His back was straight, not proud, practiced, like a man used to moving with eyes on him, even when those eyes didn't understand what they were seeing. Delgado finally took a slow breath, then reached for the radio on his belt, clicked once, and said only this: "Observer stays on field. Let the next group roll. Rourke's staying where he is." No explanation, no further order. The man who had once led with silence now let it speak. The sun crested higher as the field was cleared and re-prepped for the fire stress drill, the kind of exercise designed to compress chaos into 20-yard intervals. Plastic barriers were repositioned. Smoke pods were aligned behind makeshift cover. Instructors clipped radios to belts and called out names. The next rotation began forming along the outer edge of the course, a group of 8 soldiers checking their loadouts, adjusting grips, blinking against the sharp morning glare. Private Danning stood among them, already tense from the heat, his chest rising faster than it should have. He was eager, visibly so, double-checking the positioning of his spare mag and sliding his earpiece into place with too much force. His jaw clenched as he rolled his shoulders. He had heard his name called. Alpha Group. Simulated movement under fire. Live blanks. Disorientation. Speed and control. Across the field, beyond the safety line, Jim Rourke stood where he'd always stood, near the red flag marking the edge of live protocol, clipboard tucked under one arm, vest secured, eyes quiet and unblinking. He wasn't speaking, just watching, not assessing, witnessing. As the signal whistle shrieked across the range, the first wave moved. 2 soldiers dropped behind barriers, moved low, communicating in tight gestures as smoke grenades hissed at the far end of the course. A thunder of blanks cracked through the air. Danning flinched slightly, just a beat, then recovered and stepped forward into his designated lane. The sound increased, controlled chaos. Barked directions came through radios and echoed from the walls of the adjacent storage bunker. Someone shouted to push forward. The smoke rose, not thick enough to choke, but enough to turn the space into a shifting gray of silhouettes and flashing movement. Danning reached the halfway mark, then his rifle jammed. He stopped, instinctively slapped the side of the chamber, but the weapon didn't click forward, not immediately. Then a flashbang detonated 10 feet to his right, close enough to rattle his perception but far enough to be within safety protocol. Still, the pressure made his knees tighten. He blinked rapidly, tried again to reset the rifle. Another pop, another shout. "Move, Danning! Move now!" It was the range instructor's voice, sharp, unyielding, but Danning didn't move. His hands locked around the weapon, not frozen in place like someone resisting, but caught, mentally jammed in the same way the rifle had been. His shoulders trembled now, not from the noise, from the internal scream of inexperience finally collapsing under the weight of its own bluff. The others kept moving. Shots rang out in staggered patterns. Comms chirped in overlapping cadence. But Danning stood there, mouth open, not speaking. His eyes darted. He couldn't see the end of the course anymore. Couldn't find the exit point. It had vanished behind smoke and pressure and his own failure to breathe. Then, from the sideline, movement. Jim stepped past the safety flag. No announcement, no permission. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just moved, straight into the course with the calm of someone who had walked toward worse sounds under real skies. His boots crunched once against the gravel, then steadied into the broken lane between cover barriers. A few instructors moved forward, startled, hands raised, about to halt the exercise, but the master sergeant at the platform lifted a single finger. "Let him through," Delgado said. Jim walked until he reached Danning's position. Smoke swirled around them, but the old man didn't seem to notice. His boots stopped just short of the jammed rifle's barrel. He crouched slowly, one knee brushing against the synthetic grass mat, and looked up at the young soldier. "You've got your left thumb wrong," he said softly, steady as granite. "You're choking your own shot. Loosen it." Danning's eyes widened. He didn't speak. Jim didn't move. "You're not gonna die here, but act like you know how to live. Breathe." The noise of the drill continued behind them, instructors shouting, fire lines shifting. But in the small circle of dust between these two men, there was silence, a kind of clarity. Jim waited only a second more, then reached up and placed his hand against Danning's upper back. Not hard, just enough to steady, enough to say, "You're not alone." Then, voice low, "Move." Danning blinked once, then twice. And this time, he moved. Not perfectly, not quickly, but forward. The drill concluded with the sharp staccato blast of a final whistle. The sound echoed across the range like a door slamming on chaos, cutting through smoke and chatter with finality. Movement slowed. Soldiers lowered their weapons. Instructors stepped forward from their corners. Radios crackled once more, this time with range-clear confirmations. What had moments ago felt like a storm now settled into the dry hum of a warm breeze tugging at fatigues and kicking small clouds of grit across the field. Private Danning sat on the gravel just outside the designated live zone, his elbows resting on his knees. Hands slack, weapon laid flat beside him like something temporarily discarded. His helmet was slightly off-center, one strap loose against his neck. His breath came slow now, not panicked, but heavy. Controlled again. Earned. Across from him, not 3 feet away, Jim Rourke lowered himself to the ground in the same quiet way he always moved. No ceremony, no fatigue, just age carried with grace. His knees bent carefully, one after the other, and he sat with the ease of someone who'd waited out worse days on rougher ground. He didn't look at Danning immediately, just rested his back against the low tire wall near the edge of the training course and pulled off his vest, letting it drop beside him with a dull thud. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them returned to rhythm. Boots trudged through the dirt. Magazines were returned to crates, training flags lowered. Somewhere to the side, an officer called out to check comm gear. But the space between Jim and Danning remained untouched by all of it. A rare kind of silence that couldn't be interrupted. Danning's fingers twitched once on his knee. Then he turned his head slightly and looked at the older man, not with pride, not with embarrassment, just a kind of quiet confusion. Not about what had happened, but about what hadn't. There'd been no lecture, no scolding, no "I told you so" waiting to land. Just calm and presence, and a single hand on his back in the middle of fire. Jim reached into his side pouch and withdrew a green canteen with worn rubber trim and handed it across the space between them. Danning hesitated only a second, then took it with both hands. He drank, then offered it back. Jim didn't move to take it, just nodded once, like the gesture had already been enough. They sat like that for a while, long enough for the sun to tilt a little higher, for the comm's chatter to fade back into checklist tone, for the dust to settle in a layer on the back of boots and the creases of elbows. Long enough that neither felt rushed to leave. Behind them, near the post by the range tower, Master Sergeant Delgado stood with his arms crossed again, watching the stillness unfold. He didn't smile, didn't comment, just turned and walked toward the operations tent, slow and deliberate, his shadow stretching behind him like a trail of understanding. Back in the field, Danning finally set the canteen down and looked forward. Not at anything. Just into the distance, through the cleared haze of smoke, where the target stood peppered with impacts. Some missed, some perfect. He didn't say thank you. Didn't need to. Jim leaned forward slightly and adjusted the position of his boots in the gravel. His hands rested on his thighs. The tremor was there again, faint, pulsing in one knuckle, but his grip never failed. A few younger recruits passed by in the distance, their voices low, not mocking now, just distant, normal. One of them glanced toward the seated pair, hesitated, then kept walking. No laughter followed, only the sound of wind tugging faintly at the edges of spent shell casings. Danning shifted, not away from Jim, just closer to center. There was a question hanging in the air between them, not spoken, but present. Jim didn't answer it, not yet. Sometimes silence was enough. The range quieted further as gear was stowed and rotations completed. A faint breeze rolled over the open field, carrying with it the mingled scent of gunpowder, dry dust, and something older, the sun-warmed echo of sweat on canvas and the earthiness of trampled grass beneath decades of boots. In the distance, someone zipped a supply bag closed. A bird called from the edge of the pines. The loudest sounds had passed. What remained was the kind of stillness that invited reflection, the kind earned by surviving louder things. Master Sergeant Delgado stood under the canvas flap of the operations tent, one hand resting on the edge of the table where training rosters were stacked beside scuffed radios and half-finished clipboards. A junior instructor beside him was writing something down, but Delgado wasn't looking at the paperwork. His gaze was still fixed on the two figures seated near the edge of the field, the old man and the private. One had carried weight, the other had just begun to understand it. After a moment, Delgado cleared his throat and said quietly, without turning his head, "That man out there, Rourke, he's not just another safety volunteer." The instructor looked up, curious. Delgado's voice didn't change. He ran three-man rescue patrols during the siege in Fallujah, buildings wired with charges, snipers on roofs, everything collapsing around him. He kept going, got 3 wounded men out before the structure fell. One of those men was my brother. There was no awe in the way he spoke, just reverence. Clean, like stating a truth too large for embellishment. The junior instructor blinked, pen pausing mid-sentence. "I didn't know. Most don't," Delgado said. "He doesn't talk about it, doesn't want to, but I watched him put pressure on a jugular with a rag torn from his own sleeve. Watched him reset a shattered comm system using a piece of rebar in his body as the grounding line. And now he's out here, polishing casings and giving advice to kids who laugh in his face." He turned then, his eyes still calm, but narrowed with a certain weight. "That's a kind of strength they don't teach anymore." Out on the field, Danning remained seated, his legs stretched forward now, boots dusty and half-shadowed in the slanting afternoon sun. His breathing had returned to normal, but his mind hadn't. He kept glancing toward Jim as if waiting for the older man to speak first, to tell him what he was supposed to feel, or do, or say. But Jim said nothing. Not until Danning finally asked, voice rough from the dryness in his throat and something else, a newness behind the tone. "How'd you even move with that much fire? Everyone I know says they'd freeze." Jim didn't look at him right away. Instead, he reached down and pulled a small length of frayed green paracord from the side pocket of his vest. It was tied in a simple loop, weathered and softened by age. He rolled it between his fingers once before answering. "You move," he said slowly, "because someone else needs you to, not because you want to." His voice didn't carry weight. It released it. He let the words settle, then placed the paracord back in the pocket, as if it had spoken its piece too. Danning didn't ask who the cord belonged to. Didn't have to. He just sat still, the silence between them no longer awkward or uncertain, but filled with something reverent. The kind of space where respect was born not from confession, but from earned presence. Somewhere behind them, laughter rose again, faint and distant, harmless this time. The next wave of soldiers was gathering near the southern edge of the field for range reset, but Danning didn't move, and neither did Jim. There was nothing left to prove, only something to carry forward. The next training day began the same way all the others had. The sky above the range was clear and unforgiving, the kind of blue that held no softness. Soldiers moved through early morning checks, loading gear with the practiced rhythm of repetition. The hum of the base generator underscored the click of safety checks and the dull thuds of sandbag repositioning. Wind pushed dry grit along the perimeter fences, dusting the backs of boots and the folding legs of supply tables. But something had shifted, not in the procedures, in the air itself. Jim arrived as he always did, early, quiet, unnoticed by most. His brass bag slung over one shoulder, the clipboard tucked under the other arm, the same field cap pulled low across his brow. But when he approached the west side bench near the observation line, he paused. There was a new sign mounted on the frame, just above the seat. Not painted, not flashy. A simple aluminum plaque, brushed metal, bolted into the grain of the old wood. Reserved seating, veteran advisor. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. He reached out and ran one weathered finger across the engraving. Not reverently, but curiously, as if making sure it was real. There was no audience, no announcement, just a piece of metal, placed with intention, saying what no voice had yet spoken. Jim sat down slowly. The bench groaned softly beneath his weight. From this angle, he could see the full layout of the training course, the angled barriers, the staggered cone lines, the simulated breaching obstacles. His eyes tracked the stations instinctively, every distance measured in his mind, every cover point recalled. The old skills hadn't faded. They had simply found quieter ways to remain useful. Nearby, a pair of younger instructors were adjusting a target bracket. One of them turned, noticed Jim, then nodded once. Not forced, not performative. Just a nod, the kind shared by those who know when to speak and when to let silence honor what words can't. Danning arrived 5 minutes early. His posture had changed. Not stiff, not overly formal, just centered, grounded. He moved with more precision now, but less tension, like someone who had learned where to place their weight and why it mattered. He didn't look for Jim immediately. He moved first to the supply tent, helped with 2 crate lifts, then joined the setup crew at the line. Only after completing his tasks did he approach the bench. He didn't speak. He just set a small folding stool on the ground beside Jim's bench, placed a fresh bottle of water near the older man's boot, and took a seat. Not at Jim's feet, not across from him, beside him, level, equal, but learning. Jim glanced at the bottle, then at the boy, then back to the range. A few moments passed. Then a third figure approached from the left perimeter. Delgado, in full fatigues, clipboard under one arm, radio on his belt. He stopped in front of the bench. "Rourke," he said plainly. Jim looked up. "You'll find your name on the safety board from now on," Delgado added, motioning with his chin toward the main command tent. "Top right corner. It's permanent." There was no ceremony in the tone. No flair, just policy spoken with quiet respect. Jim nodded once. Delgado turned and walked away. Danning looked over, mouth open slightly, but didn't ask anything. Whatever questions he had could wait. He'd learned now. Understanding didn't always arrive when you asked. Sometimes it came after. The training course came to life again. Whistle blows, boot fall against gravel, orders echoing across the lanes. But near the veteran advisor's bench, no one raised their voice. No one chuckled at the past. Instead, they moved differently, quieter, sharper, as though they'd all remembered what this place stood for, and who had kept it standing long before they were ever handed a uniform. No medals, no speeches, just the name added to the board, and the way the drill line shifted to make room, not for authority, but for earned presence. 1 week later, the sun returned to its perch above the training range, casting long shadows across the gravel and faded paint lines that divided each fire lane. The morning light had a crispness to it, cutting sharper through the cooler air as the season began its turn toward autumn. A soft wind rustled the edge of the perimeter tops, and the scent of oil, steel, and sun-baked canvas hovered like an old song. Jim Rourke arrived without ceremony, as always. The same duffel slung over his shoulder, the same careful step, knees still tight from the chill. His hands were gloved today, Not for style, but because the early cold had started to nip at his fingers. He paused near the edge of the lot, where the asphalt gave way to packed dirt, and watched the range unfold. What met him was not fanfare, not attention, just readiness. Private Danning was already there, his jacket half unzipped, clipboard under one arm, assisting a younger recruit with stance corrections on the outer lanes. His words were quiet, gestures minimal, but precise. He didn't posture. He taught. And when the recruit nodded and squared up again, Danning gave a brief word of encouragement and turned, not toward the group, but toward the bench. Jim made his way across the yard, gravel crunching underfoot, the early sun gleaming off the edge of the small plaque still bolted above the veteran advisor's seat. A faint layer of dust had gathered since the week before. Before sitting, he pulled a handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped it clean, not out of pride, but out of habit. Then he lowered himself onto the bench, exhaled, and took in the field. Danning approached moments later with 2 paper cups in hand, coffee. One was placed on the bench beside Jim's right thigh. No words, no announcement, just placed with the same quiet gesture the older man had once offered a canteen. Jim nodded. Once. That was all. A new rotation of soldiers began to form along the ready line. None of them approached Jim directly, not yet, but 1 or 2 glanced in his direction, then adjusted their postures. A young specialist tightened his stance after watching Danning correct a recruit. The range instructors moved with more awareness now, eyes sweeping not just for safety, but for presence, as though each corner of the field now held more meaning. Delgado stood near the operations tent again, this time with his arms behind his back. He didn't approach, didn't need to. His gaze moved from the safety board, where Jim's name now sat etched into laminate, to the bench, to the men gathering along the course. His shoulders eased, the kind of satisfaction that comes not from change, but from restoration. A new recruit sat near Danning during the midday break. No rank yet, barely out of orientation. His voice was soft, tentative, but Jim could hear it from a few feet away. "Sir, you think I'll ever get used to the pressure?" Danning didn't respond right away. He looked to Jim, not for permission, but acknowledgement. Jim gave the smallest shake of his head. Not no, but not yet. Then Danning answered, "You get used to moving anyway." Jim's eyes closed for a moment. He didn't smile, but something inside settled deeper. Afternoon wore on. The drills continued, and across the dust-lined bench, a coffee cup sat empty beside a pair of gloves folded in the sun. That bench would always be there now, not for decoration, for legacy. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.